Welcome. Today I'm going to take you through paper F8 and in particular one area that seems to cause students a lot of problems on the exam. That area, internal controls. Now from my experience it's not the technical side of controls that causes students problems, it's the practical questions. On the exam there are three basic types of practical question you might be asked. The first of those, control objectives. Secondly, control procedures. And thirdly, tests of control. So let's take a look at those three things in order, just to make sure we understand the difference. Firstly, control objectives. So what is an objective? Well, an objective is your target or your aim, what you want to happen. And generally we can split this into two things. On the one hand, we want something good to happen. For example, making sure that we deal with all customer orders as quickly and efficiently as we can. On the other hand, sometimes our objective is to avoid a bad thing happening. So for example, businesses want to try to make sure that their assets are safe. Now let's look at control procedures. A control procedure is what a company does to try to make sure that its control objective is met. For example, reconciliations such as bank reconciliations help to make sure that the numbers in the financial statements are accurate. A lot of control procedures are physical controls like alarm systems, CCTV and locks on doors. So far, we seem to be okay. Objectives and procedures seem to fit together fairly nicely, and it's fairly obvious the difference between the two. The one that students really seem to find the hardest, tests of control. Companies set their objectives, and companies put control procedures in place to meet those objectives. But tests of control are a bit different. Because the tests of control are what auditors do to check to see if the control procedures that the company has put in place are operating properly. On the exam, there are basically three types of test of control. One way to check if a control is operating properly is simply to ask the company's staff whether the control takes place. Of course, this is not foolproof because there's a risk the staff will say yes, it's happening, even if it's not happening, because they're afraid of confessing to the truth. A second test of control is inspection. Typically, when controls are carried out, the person who does that control procedure would sign something off to say that they've done it. So the auditor can look at documents, look for that signature as proof that the control took place. Again, it's not foolproof, because the member of staff at the company, of course, might have simply signed something without actually doing the procedure. A third approach is to simply watch the control procedure taking place, to observe it happening. Again, it's not perfect. When people are being watched, they tend to do things properly. The bigger issue is probably, does the control take place when the auditor is not watching it? Let's now take a look at an example. One objective, as we saw earlier, for a company is that its assets are not stolen. Let's now look at potential control procedures. Well, if you've got expensive assets, you should lock them away, especially at night when there's no one else in the building and the risk of theft is greater. A second simple control procedure would be to have security guards monitoring your building. So far, so good. Fairly obvious objective, fairly obvious procedures. Now let's look at the tests of those controls. How would an auditor know that assets are being locked away at night? Probably the best way, at the end of the day, go and see if the assets are being locked away. Observe it. How does an auditor know if there are security guards who would stop assets being stolen? Well, it might sound a bit strange, but probably the best way to check this one out is to try to take the assets and see if the security guards try to stop you. Now at this point you might be wondering why there is exam confusion. I mean, the three things seem to be very different. The problem is that I'm looking at all three things one after the other, and unfortunately the examiner may only set one of them. If that's what the examiner does, my top tip for the exam is still think about all three. Because if you think about all three, your mind will be clearer and you can then select the one that the examiner actually asked for. So let's try this process out. Exam question says, suggest tests of control over sales invoicing. Well, one objective for sales invoicing is we only invoice our customers for the goods we actually delivered. So that's the first stage, the objective. What do companies do to try to make sure that they only invoice customers for goods delivered? Answer: check the sales invoice to the record of the goods that were delivered, which is called a goods dispatch note. So we have objective, we have procedure. Third stage, control test. How would an auditor know that the company has checked the sales invoice to the goods dispatch note? The answer, of course, is that whoever did that check at the company would surely have signed the invoice to show that they'd checked it to the goods dispatch note. So what's the test of control? Inspect the invoice to see that the signature is there. We've gone through all three stages. The examiner asked for test of control, so it's the last one, in red, which is the answer to the question. The key to this is practice. If you practice generating all three, even on exam day, the confusion should go away.